in Manhattan. This is a group that mostly Ivy League MBA students, and they put together a conference. They organize it, they lead it, and one of the things they do is talk about how faith interacts with business practices. And so there was a presentation by a couple of partners from Goldman Sachs on Wall Street on servant leadership. And so they start out talking about Jesus and his teachings and the actions and how he modeled it. Then they go to Greenleaf and they talk about how the servant leader is servant first and all the things that we know from Greenleaf's work. And so they finish their presentation and they get to the Q&A, and one of the guys from Harvard raises his hand and he says, "Sounds great, but does it really work?" Because this audience was full of the future CEOs of America, and they like the theory, but they're thinking, I'm going to be a doormat. I'm just going to get run over in business if I am a servant leader. So it was a legitimate question. So I get on my phone real quick. Well, the answer, I got to tell you, the answer was, well, Jesus was the greatest leader of all time. It worked for him, so it'll work for you. Was basically what it boiled down to. So that was a very unsatisfying answer for me. So I'm getting on my phone and doing some research on, okay, where's the empirical data that I can show these guys? And there just really wasn't anything out there. There's a lot of research, a lot of theory, and a lot of scale development and all of these things. But as far as looking to see, does it work in business settings and in boss-employee relationships and things like that, there's just really not much out there. And I thought, well, maybe these guys, they're business guys, maybe they are more familiar with and more comfortable with level 5 leadership. So level 5 leadership, there we go, level 5 leadership, Jim Collins is the best-selling business author of our generation. He's got 6 best-selling books, and out of all of those 6 best-selling books, there's really one chapter that he's probably best known for. In his book, Good to Great, he wants to look at how companies, or the question is, can companies that are good companies become great companies? And so he looked at financial results from the past 100 years or so, 1,100 U.S. corporations. Are there companies that have been good for a long time and then immediately jump to great and stay great? Is that possible? Out of the 1,100 or 1,300 companies he looked at, there were 11 companies that had done that. And one of the things that he found, he talks about in the second chapter of Good to Great, is all of these 11 companies had the same thing in common that the comparison companies that he compared them to in the same industry didn't have. And they had a hard time defining exactly what it was, but they said these guys are humble, but they're driven. And they talked about calling it, when they were having the debate among the research team, they talked about calling it servant leadership. And they said, no, it's different than servant leadership. These guys are really driven. But there is this idea of personal humility. So these guys are humble, they listen to other people, but they have this professional will. He said that they are driven to achieve. He said they have an absolute, obsessed, burning, compulsive ambition that's not about them. It's about the organization. It's about the cause. And not themselves. And they didn't know what to call it, so they finally just called it level 5 leadership. And so then this has become, in business circles, this has become well known. There is no academic research on this. And I'll tell you why in a second. But one of the interesting things, a quote I came across from Dr. Patterson and co-authors is, servant leaders and level 5 leaders are not antithetical. In fact, they may be the same leaders. And so that intrigued me. And I thought, well, what do we know about level 5 leaders? Well, the problem is Collins' research is flawed on this topic. And I've uploaded my paper, by the way, so you can look at all the details of some of the things I'm going to skim over pretty quickly here. But we've got some flawed research here that's drawn some conclusions. And so what I wanted to do is say we need to get some good research on level 5 leadership that we can draw some conclusions. The problem is Collins simply described level 5 leadership. He didn't provide any instrument to measure it. He just said, this is sort of what they look like, and gave some examples. And so that led me, this quote and the desire to learn more led me to my PhD dissertation a couple of years ago, where I said, okay, I want to develop an instrument. So that was my dissertation, was developing an instrument so we could measure it. And so now we can look at it from an academic perspective and see how that compares. So for this research project, I wanted to look at 3 different types of leadership. I wanted to start with transformational leadership. Transformational leadership has been used as much as all other leadership types combined in leadership research. So we've got a phenomenal wealth of information available to us on transformational leadership. So I wanted to include that. But when we look at the constructs of these 3 leaderships, each of them have a little different perspective, a different angle on what the leader is looking at. So for example, transformational, they focus on elevating the performance of the organization by stirring followers to look beyond their own self-interest for the good of the group. So it's about how I help the organization achieve through inspiring my followers. It may or may not have some of the same character or leader, that's a transformational leader, may or may not have servant leadership or level 5 leadership characteristics. Then we look at level 5 leaders, and level 5 leaders are in service to the organization or cause, not their followers. So they are all about that obsessed, burning, compulsive ambition for the organization. If the follower benefits, great. If not, I'm all about the organization and the cause and how do I move that forward. And then servant leadership, of course, is focused on serving the followers. And we've got organizational objectives are subordinate. So the idea is if I serve the followers, if my followers benefit from my leadership, then the organization as a whole is going to benefit, but I'm not doing it for the organization. I'm doing it for my followers. So even though there's some similarities there, and we see some things that may make these look similar, they each have their own focus and construct. So for this research, what I did, first of all, looking at the data model, I got 3 independent variables. So we've got transformational leadership as a scale of 1 to 5. Level 5 leadership is dichotomous. Jim Collins described they're either level 5 or they're not level 5. There's no scale, there's no in between. It's black or white. And then servant leadership is a scale of 1 to 5. And then our dependent variable here is the perception of boss performance. So from a follower perspective, is my boss more successful or less successful than his peers? And so let's break this down a little bit. First of all, transformational leadership, I think with this audience, I don't have to spend a whole lot of time on this. Like I said, it's more than all other measurements or instruments combined. So 45 items using the MLQ. I also got data on transactional and passive leadership, but for this particular project, I was only looking at the transformational piece of that. For servant leadership, there's a lot of different instruments out there that have come along in the past, well, since '77 probably, when Greenlee first introduced it. But one I liked came out in 2015 called Essential Behaviors of Servant Leadership. So Dr. Winston, Dale Fields put together this instrument that looked at what are the behaviors, taking out a meta approach to all of these things we know about servant leadership. What are the behaviors of what a servant leader looks like? So the question on the survey, to what extent do the following statements describe the behavior of your boss? So practices what he preaches, serves people without regard to nationality, gender, or race, sees serving as a mission or responsibility to others, shows genuine interest in employees as people, understands that serving others is most important, is willing to make sacrifices, seeks to instill trust, is always honest, driven by a sense of higher calling, and promotes values that transcend self-interest and material success. So those are the questions that our folks were asked to respond to. How does your boss reflect those behaviors? So then the instruments measure level 5 leadership that I developed in my dissertation. On a scale of 1 to 10, to what extent do the following characteristics describe your boss? So we've got the 2 different constructs of level 5 leadership. We've got the personal humility. So there's 5 characteristics of personal humility. And then professional will, that intense resolve, dedication, etc. So that was included to measure level 5. To just give you an idea of what the level 5, so this is sort of a new idea. When I looked at measuring the responses on the level 5 leader, what I've got here is personal humility on the x-axis. So low personal humility to high personal humility, and then on the y-axis professional will, low will to high will. I call that knob right there Donald Trump. So you've got the very intense professional will, a 1 on the humility. Over here we've got got leaders that are humble, but really don't have that drive or determination. They're humble folks that sort of plod along and get the job done. And here you just got generally just weak leaders. They're low in both areas. So really what we're focused on, and here's the ones we like. So level 5 leaders, they're high in both measures. So then to measure success, there are several different ways we can do that. What I want to do is start with the followers' perception. So we talked this morning about followers and how they're engaged in the process. And so here we look at the followers' perception of the boss. So the first question on this section was, what is the most important objective indicator of the performance of your boss? So sometimes it was sales, and sometimes it was profit, or employee turnover, or whatever that objective measure is. And the follow-up question was, okay, how does your boss compare to his peers on that measure? Below average, above average, about average, that type of thing. And so then each of them was identified for that. So the research questions that we wanted to get to: is there a statistically significant relationship between leadership type and followers' perception of the boss's performance? Which leadership type is the best predictor of the follower's perception of the boss's performance review? And is there a strong correlation between these 3 different types of leadership? So, to get to the answers, by the way, out of curiosity, what do you think on these? Is there a statistically significant relationship between leadership type and performance? Yes or no? Yes? No?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Which leadership type is the best predictor? What do you think? Based on what you've read of all of them.
Servant leadership.
5.
Level 5, servant. Nobody's taking transformational?
It
Okay.
depends.
All right. Is there a strong correlation between these 3? Do followers tend to identify if their boss tends to be one of them? Do they tend to be all 3 of them? Okay, let's find out. The results. First of all, the participants. So here's a little view of who we had participated in. All of them were adult, American, full-time employees with a boss. From a gender and age perspective, pretty good representation of both genders, all age ranges from under 30 to over 60. When we look at the type of organizations they work for and the participants' job level, not to go into detail, but just sort of show you, we've got folks from for-profit companies, education, nonprofits, from clerical and service down to senior management, teachers, individual contributors, so sort of a wide range of people with bosses. When we looked at that question of how does your boss compare to his peers, one of the things that was interesting is 105 plus 56 said their bosses were above average. So that's 60% of the people polled thought their bosses were above average in performance. There's some research behind it. I won't get into the details on that. Sort of that, hey, we're a team, we're together, so it tends to skew to the right there a little bit. When we benchmark that against level 5 leaders and see how those break out, it's sort of interesting. The blue line here is level 5 leaders. So if an employee thought that their boss was a level 5 leader, 54% of them said they were above average in performance, 35% of them said far above average in performance. So together, 89% of level 5 leaders are considered to be above average. Compare that to the non-level 5 leaders, and less, so actually 49%. So you've got 89% of level 5 leaders who are average or above, and are far above, 49% of non-level 5 leaders. So we can sort of, without even putting any statistics to it yet, we can sort of look at it and say, yeah, level 5 leaders do better than non-level 5 leaders. So now let's put some statistics to it. Doing some ordinal regression on this and looking at, and again, you can check the paper online and get the details of this. I'm going to hit this pretty quick. But when we look at the R-square, or the pseudo R-square in ordinal, we look at level 5, and it comes up 12.6% of the variability is attributed to my level 5 leader. Now, I was actually personally hoping, I was sort of rooting for that one, to say, hey, that'd be a good one. But the data is what it is. 12.6. It is positive and it is statistically significant, but only 12.6. Transformational leadership, 19.6% of the variability accounted for by transformational leadership. Servant leadership, 23.6. If we put all of them together, the model shows 25.1. So really not a whole lot more than what servant leadership by itself accounts for. One of the interesting things is when we put all three of them together, level 5 and transformational becomes statistically insignificant. Servant leadership remains statistically significant. So clearly servant leadership is the one that's driving the results on this as far as the follower perception. So when we look at correlation between the three of them, what we find is particularly transformational leadership and servant leadership, very strong correlation between those two. All of them are positive and statistically significant. Level 5 is really the least correlated with the other two, but they are strongly correlated. So typically, if somebody sees their boss as one, they tend to see the others also, or see the other labels as well. So we go back to the research questions. Is there a statistically significant relationship? Yes. Which leadership type is the best predictor? Servant leadership, and yes, there is a strong correlation between follower perceptions of those three. So with that, are there any questions?
What's next?
You know, I heard it said one time, when you go to the well on research, take a big bucket. I've got a ton of data. So this was the very first. So one of the interesting things is the difference between profit and nonprofit. So for example, what I found is more people that are level 5 and servant leaders tend to migrate to nonprofit organizations. So there are much more nonprofit, or those types of leaders are much more likely to be a nonprofit than for-profit. So I think that's an interesting angle to take on it. That's probably my next one. Yes, ma'am.
Can you go back to your question? So I struggle with the second one because I'm wondering how culture and mission of the organization relates to that and plays into that. Because when I think about different organizations, there are some that servant leadership, there's just no freaking way that that's going to be valid. So can you share any thoughts you had on that?
You know, that's an interesting point. I didn't go to that level as far as saying, what is your organization? That might be an interesting follow-up study to say, well, particularly if you focus in on one of the things I thought about doing was taking two organizations that are similar in nature and test the hypothesis on one that tends to be more servant. In fact, my former employer is a pretty servant-led organization. We've got a competitor that I would say is not. And so it'd be interesting to compare the results of those two and see what that looks like.
Or even by industry.
Yeah.
So like financial services versus automotive, or, you know,
Yeah.
just a thought.
Good. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Wilbur.